Hi there, I'm Scott Brennan. I'm here with Ray Simpson. Hi Ray.
Hi Scott.
We are back in High Rig on Holy Island, and this is the second session in our Aidan and Hilda week. This week, what are you going to be talking about? Today, what are you going to be talking about, Ray?
I'm going to talk about 3 female saints.
3 female saints. Okay, wonderful. Well, I will hand over to Ray. Enjoy.
Thank you. The reason that there are so few female saints, although there are quite a few, is because the Bible and most Christian history has been written in a patriarchal age, and therefore by men who have a man's agenda, which is very often about power. So women get very little look in, and this is true of the age I'm talking about. We had one very, very good historian, Bede, and there's no other historian as good as him around for that period. But he also almost entirely focused on men. But some women were so holy and influential they got a paragraph in his record, or a paragraph or two. But so he does give us a glimpse of some of the women. But there are other sources, which is local tradition, handed down through the ages. For example, further down this east coast of Britain is a place called Beadnell, and there's a church named after St. Ebba, and they call her the Mother of Northumbria. And I went to preach there, and I said, "That's not in Bede. Where did this come from?" And they said, "Oh, we've always known her as the Mother of Northumbria." And there's a third source, and that is legendary lives. For example, several hundred years after Bega, as I'm calling her, went to what is now St. Bees in Cumbria and possibly founded a monastery, there was a great legendary life. And from this legendary life, which is in the London British Library, the British Museum Library, people like Melvyn Bragg, who's a broadcaster, have written novels, and Tolkien, who was an Anglo-Saxon scholar at Oxford, wrote The Lord of the Rings. You've probably seen the films or read the books, The Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. But the ring idea he got from the legendary life of Bega. And so I will tell you about Bega. She fled from Ireland because in those days a woman who was pretty, or whose father was a chief or a prince or something like that, they were very much courted by warriors, important people, and so a man wanted to have her and rape her and so on, just like Harvey Weinstein and all that lot in Hollywood. They're the equivalent today. And she fled. Her father was furious because he wanted to marry his daughter off to a VIP and have lots of children happily ever after. But she fled. She loved God and she wanted not to be violated, and she wanted to be a virgin for God, to give birth to Christ, as it were, in 100 different ways. And as she fled, she came across a group of 3 sisters who were kind of got nuns' vows, living in a house somewhere, and she sought refuge for the night. And they told her, this is according to one legend, that they'd each said they'd have a ring. There'd just be 3 of them, and they'd be dedicated to the Trinity. But it was really more like a bracelet, because they each put a finger in one ring. And so they were bound together by the Trinity in this one ring, that the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. And they, blessing her and praying for her, gave her this very, very precious Trinity ring and said, "This ring will keep you safe wherever you flee to. You need it more than we do," which was very sacrificial of them. And so Bega flees with this ring, And she comes over from Ireland to the Irish settlement at Dalriada that we talked about the other day, which is modern Argyll and the Isles in Scotland. And somehow or other she met Oswald, who, we learned yesterday, was as a boy brought up in the Dalriada court and became baptised as a Christian at Iona, and other people were a lot of Christians around. And it seems that Oswald had said to her, if and when I get the throne of Northumbria back, I will give you safe passage and give you a place where you can start a monastery. And so the time came when she fled to the kingdom of Reged, which is sort of Carlisle, there was a Christian king there, and then she went along the coast and came to Oswald's territory when he became king. And there are various stories about what she did there. One of them is attributed to the monastery that succeeded her a century later, and one of them thinks she did it. But according to the story, here's a woman with nothing, no money, and she arrives in a strange place. And she goes up to a local farmer and said, will you give me some of the land and I'll start a school for all the children around here? And the farmer says no. And she said, but if God gave you snow in June, would you then know that it was God's doing a sovereign act, and would you then obey God? And he said, oh well, not likely to get snow in June, so I'll say yes to that. And well, strangely enough, it snowed in. I have known it snowed in June or July once in my lifetime, but I can't. It was many years ago. But anyway, it snowed in June, and so the farmer gave her this land. And if you want to read all about it, because I've imagined what she did, it's in my novel on Aidan of Lindisfarne, and how she got all the children, and they made all sorts of things, and they danced, and they learned the scriptures, and they loved Jesus. She had a whale of a time. Well, now, we then come back to Aidan, whom we talked about yesterday, and Oswald asking Iona to send a mission to his kingdom. Now, Aidan was a man. He came with 12 males, 12 apostles, young monks, different age monks. And that is the way everybody did Christianity. However, as I mentioned yesterday, Aidan's Island they were not only mesmerised by Luke's account of the 12 apostles, they were mesmerised by Luke's account of all the women who helped in the ministry of Jesus and accompanied him and received them in Jerusalem and cooked for them. And everybody came to the women as when the men were out on the road, they all came to the women all day and chatted. And the women told them all about Jesus. We can intuit that that's what women were doing from Luke's Gospel. And so in Ireland, they said we mustn't only have our apostles, we must have our spiritual foster mothers. And they had, in pagan times, that women were better treated in Ireland than in many countries in the Roman Empire. They were thought more highly of, because they'd had the goddess Brigid, for example, and other gods of fertility. And so the goddesses were equally important to the gods in pagan Ireland. And then a woman came along who was named by her pagan father, Brigid, after the goddess. But she became a Christian as a girl, and she was a wow of a woman. And she won the whole of Ireland to Jesus in all wonderful ways and set up a community in the middle of Kildare. And they used to say the whole of Ireland was the centres of influence in Ireland were the hills, forts on the hilltops. And now, within 2 generations of Brigid, the centres of influence are her sanctuaries, her little communities for women or men, all over the place, and they, including on the hilltops. So pagan Ireland became Christian Ireland, and Brigid was the mother of Ireland. She was like Mary, the mother of the Gael. And when she came to a synod of the church, the bishop said, here comes the mother of the Gael. Well, Aidan came from an island with all these spiritual foster mothers to a totally different culture, Saxon culture. I have read somewhere or other that some of the top Saxons sent their sons and possibly daughters, to be educated by a very important person, including women. But the idea of the spiritual foster mothers fostering Jesus and the whole population, which they had in Ireland, was not there in the Saxon kingdoms. So I intuit that Aidan said to himself at some point, we've set up our faith-sharing team of monks, we've set up our colony of heaven at Lindisfarne and Melrose, and we're setting them up all round, but this is all by males. We must have the spiritual foster mothers too. There was an advertisement for a beer which said, this can reach the parts others cannot reach. And I think Aidan thought that the women would reach parts of the tough Saxon psyche that the men couldn't reach. This is my intuition, it's not in any document. And so he gathered, but how would he gather the spiritual foster mothers? Well, I think if I was writing a novel of all this, I would say that Bega was the first one to land on Aidan's plate, as it were. And Oswald had given her safe passage to his kingdom. She'd come up the coast, which is a jolly long walk from here to Carlisle. What would it take? 3 days, would it? At least, I think, more. And maybe Oswald told Aidan, she's come, you've got to, as a bishop, receive her vows and give her the veil. But Aidan was unbelievably busy training up his faith-sharing team, establishing his colony of heaven at Lindisfarne, serving the needs of all the VIPs at Bamborough at the King's Court. How could he possibly make time? But I think he may have found time in his diary to go, and gave her the veil and accepted her as a nun. And if so, it is likely that after a time he said to her, because I'm jumping now, because we'll find out how he asked Hilda to start 1 or 2 places, but he asked Bigu to become the abbess of a community for men and women in what we now call Hartlepool. It was called Hartspool, and it was on the headland. So it's not in the modern town of Hartlepool, it's in the Hartlepool headland. And they had a monastery there for men and women, and I think Aidan said, you must be in charge. Now, she is called St Hugh in Bede, and there's argument whether it was Bigu or not, but anyway, let's say it was Bigu, and because she went there, and then she said she became a hermit, and then later there are stories that where Hilda, which we'll come to tomorrow, had founded a daughter monastery at Hackness, up in Yorkshire, down in Yorkshire, I should say. And in this daughter monastery of Hackness, there was a sister, a nun called Bigu, which almost certainly I would have thought is the same as the Bigu. It's just a slightly different spelling. Some think she was just on a visit, staying there, but I think it's more likely she joined the sisters in this new daughter monastery. And there's a wonderful story of how she was awakened in the night with a wonderful revelation, and the roof of the church had come off. And Hilda, who was the abbess of Whitby, which we'll learn more about another day, was being taken to heaven by angels. And she was absolutely wowed by this. So she rang all the bells and wakened all the sisters and said, our mother Hilda, 13 miles away at Whitby, is going to heaven. And they all stayed up all the night singing. They believed, you see, they took her seriously. They sang psalms all through the night to accompany Hilda to heaven. Mm. The next morning, brothers came from Whitby to say, we have news for you. Mother Hilda has died. And they said, we know. We've already been told by a heavenly communication system even better than yours. Well, they didn't say that, but they could have done. And so that's really all we know about Bega, but there is now a great new public path just opened this year, I think, from St. Bees. So the monastery she founded, if she did, became a very flourishing monastery. And the place where she had it is called St. Bees, after her. And they wrote a story about the monastery and about her and this, that and the other. So there's now a public walk from St. Bees to Robin Hood Way, which is not all that far from Whitby, where God is about to bring a revival. It could start at Robin Hood Bay, who knows?
Not as you know, Robin Hood Bay.
Rubbish? All right, well, forget that. But anyway, they walk from St. Bees to Robin Hood Bay. I don't know why they don't walk to Whitby, but they will in the future.
It's a Wainwright walk. It's 27 years old.
It's a Wainwright walk. Well, Wainwright wasn't. Well, he may have been a Christian, but I don't know if he was. Anyway, so that is Begu, and then we have. So all these women only surfaced because they had influence with royalty or something like that, which is a great pity. Now Oswald had a sister called Ebba, and she fled to Dalriada, the Irish settlement in what is now Argyll in Scotland. And she, like Oswald, came to faith while she was the guest of the king and his family and his people in the royal headquarters at Dunad, near Kilmartin, on the coast of Argyll, and it's whatever it is, 40-minute drive south from Oban, where you get the ferry to Iona, something like that. And she came to faith. So she was brought up at Bamborough, which you could see across the sea, so she probably played on the beach, pagan of course. She becomes a Christian over there, and then when Oswald gets the throne, she comes back to Bamborough as a Christian. And she wants to become a nun, and Oswald, of course, encourages her. And but that is later in her life. It is quite possible that she married. Now, this is a hypothesis. The only church outside Northumbria, which is a big area of northern England, it's Yorkshire and up to Edinburgh. The only place outside Northumbria dedicated to St. Eb, the only church, is in Oxford. There's a famous church called St. Eb's Church, Oxford. Very evangelistic church. So people have speculated why it was dedicated to her, and one supposition is that she married a Wessex, it was the Kingdom of Wessex, as Oxford was in, royal, and lived there. And to support that, we know that Oswald made friends with the King of Wessex and baptised him, or had him baptised, and was a godfather at his baptism. And Oswald had a gift of friendship, which I didn't mention yesterday, as well as all these other gifts. And he befriended the ruler of Wessex. And so it is perfectly possible, and in my novel it's what happens, that Ebba marries a Wessex prince who is a Christian, and she's a Christian, and they live until he dies. Whatever the truth of that is, but the thing is that she didn't start being a nun over this side until much later. So I think, she must have done something in between, and being married to a prince in Wessex is pretty as good as anything. She came back and asked if she could be a nun, and she was given a horrible sight, typical man, the king, Oswy, because Oswald was now dead, so Oswy was now king, and the half-brother of Oswald and half-brother was Ebba, I think, too. And he said, well, you can go to a Roman fort that was our military base, which was totally unsuitable, because if ever a war broke out, the troops would come and reoccupy it. But they renamed it Ebchester. It's still called Ebchester to this day. So where on earth is it? Somewhere near Durham. But that didn't last long, because indeed they did have a battle and she had to clear out. And she came further north. Now, I love being invited to do the services at the church of St Ebba, Beadnell, which is 30 miles south of here, down the coast, south of Bamborough, just next to sea houses, where you get a boat to the Farn Isles. And that is named after her, but also once a year the church goes out to a little open-air service on St Eb's Nook. You can go there, and in the last few years the architects of Northumbria have reconstructed an artist's impression of the nun's cell that she built there. It's not quite clear whether she just lived there as a hermit or whether she established a little nunnery. It's very near to Bamborough, and so she could have kind of come and gone to Bamborough where the royals were. I think she wanted to get away from them, but who knows. But it's a lovely place to go, and do find it. St Eb's Nook, south of Beadnell. And the church there calls her the Mother of Northumbria, and they've got some wonderful visual displays, and it's a wonderful church. It's open all day and every day, and the people who own the cafe opposite the church are open all day, and everybody's drinking coffee all day. They have little shops and bring them by, and they make beautiful everything, and people are very, very welcome. There's a big campsite there. People come on holiday. People are made very welcome. So it's one of my favourite churches in this world, St Eb's Church. But before long, she did ask for something bigger and more substantial, and so the king gave her a place north of the present border between England and Scotland. If you go to Coldingham, you'll see the Church of Scotland there is on the site of a monastery. And she founded a monastery there, and people dispute whether her monastery was where the Church of Scotland is or whether it was up on the top. But it was quite a big monastery, because we do know, this is a bit that Bede does record, that she was very worried that there was immorality going on in it. Well, if you get all these royals, just imagine getting Prince Andrew and all these other lots together in a small space. And he can't build a lodge for Jeffrey Epstein at Sandringham, so they built something like it on the outskirts. You can imagine all this going on. And it was one of the few monasteries in the whole of Northumbria that had alcohol at that early date. So the royals said, we'll have religion on our terms. Or something. She had a problem trying to get them all to love God and be disciplined. And so she asked Cuthbert, who will come on to the day after tomorrow, to do a pastoral visit. And instead of coming with his bishop's stave and setting up a safeguarding committee at the diocesan house, and everybody has to have a safeguarding officer, he did it rather differently. Are you listening, Archbishop? He went into the sea at the bottom of where the monastery was and prayed in it all night. Well, you've been in the sea for a swim in the middle of summer for half an hour, but if you pray in the sea all night, well, good on you. I'm all for it. I'm not a Cuthbert follower. But I do in my imagination. Anyway, he prayed all night, and I think he was trying to soak the whole monastery in the cleansing salt waters of God's ocean, and invite all the powers of heaven, the heavenly seas, to purify this whole place. And that's the story of when he came onto the beach, the otters came and warmed his feet. And Bede records that one of the monks, who was not allowed to spy on Cuthbert, but you see, they knew he got something. he did spy on Cuthbert and realised that he'd done this, and Cuthbert saw him and said, "Oh, you are on no account to tell anybody ever what I have done until after my death." And he vowed to keep secrecy, but he told everybody in the world as soon as Cuthbert had died.
Fair enough.
Fair enough, yes. But it was destroyed by a fire after her death and after Cuthbert's death, some years later. But when Bede was writing, he records it as God's judgment. So there we are. We have Ebba, who jolly well did her best and did some wonderful things. She didn't quite pull it off in converting all the royals to be desert fathers or good Baptists who were immersed all night and day in the purity of Christ's holiness. But she did her best, and she's the mother of Northumbria. Well, we look far and wide for other women, but of course wives were very influential. And one king, Egfrith, who was a rotten lot, who treated the Picts abominably, he was a scoundrel, but he got himself a wife now called Etheldreda, and she said, "I want to be a nun." He said, "Well, you can't be, you've got to be my wife." She said, "I'll be your wife so long as you allow me not to consummate the marriage." And so she was married to Egfrith, and she started to set up little cells, and then she got a divorce from him and went down to Ely, as it now is, and set up a wonderful monastery for women who did a lot of sewing. Now there is a life. Her other name was Audrey, and there's a book in the library there called The Life of St. Audrey. It's a very worthwhile read. And they were very, very busy. They did a lot of sewing, but they did a lot of praying, and a lot of people came to see them. They had a lot of plague and illness too, and when she died, she said, "All these horrible things affecting my skin, there's one for every jewel I once put my trust in before I gave up my jewellery and became a bride of Christ." So Etheldreda was really the founder of Ely, which is now a great cathedral in the Fens. But there was one last person I would like to mention, and that is the queens of King Oswy, the half-brother of Oswald. And Oswy, as I said yesterday, was a nominal Christian. I mean, he in his own mind, he was a very confirmed Christian. He manipulated God to further his own ends, really, which is not unusual. Almost everybody in power does the same. They have people who bless battleships and all sorts of things. Anyway, he did that, but his wife was brought up in the Roman tradition in Kent and came up and married him, and she was Fleda. And one day when it looked as if Oswy was going to lose a huge battle from a pagan invader, his wife said to him, "Tell God you'll give him 12 monasteries and dedicate our only daughter, Elfrida, to be brought up as a nun for the rest of her life, if God gives you the victory." Well, bargaining with God isn't something I see in the Gospels, but it's possibly better than nothing at all. I don't know. Anyway, so he pledged this to God, and he won the battle against the odds. He was likely he would have been killed. It was a huge invasion. And so his wife reminded him that he had to give these 12 tracts of land for new monasteries, which he did, one of which was Whitby. But he also gave the daughter, 1-year-old daughter, Elfrida, to Hilda to be mentored and tutored. She had her spiritual foster mother from the age of 1. And so Elfrida was brought up by parents in the Roman tradition, and by a spiritual foster mother who was deeply imbued with the values of Aidan and the Celtic spirituality, although she also had royal antecedents. And we don't know a lot about her childhood, but we do know that when Hilda went to Whitby, she invited Elfrida to join her. Elfrida replaced her as abbess at one point. There's some suspicion that she wasn't really up to the job, because a bishop, Trumbin, was put in to jointly rule it with her, says Bede. So that rather suggests that she needed a bit of help. But anyway, she developed a great ministry of correspondence. She travelled to other countries too. She went to Rome and so on. And she wrote these letters which have inspired people. She befriended, Cuthbert was a great friend, and she met Cuthbert on Cocket Island and asked him to prophesy over various things. But she also befriended the Putin of the church, Wilfrid, Bishop Wilfrid. And she pleaded with the king who succeeded her brother to release Wilfrid from prison, because he put Wilfrid in prison, and Wilfrid was released. And so she sought reconciliation between Ukrainians and Russians, so to speak, in terms of church. And she went to minister to Wilfrid when he was dying, and Wilfrid, who I'm his number one enemy, I call him the bad boy of Lindisfarne, because he trained him. He was an awful man in many ways, but he died a good death at Hexham. So you know, and if you die a good death, that can atone for an awful lot of things that went before, and she was very instrumental in that. So and she started a faith community at Hexham before Wilfrid went back there to do it, and she appointed a man called a weenie who saw angels all day long, and so there's a holiness about the place she started at Hexham that's worth a visit. So those are my three women, or four women, and I have some exercises for you. But before I come on to that, using great generalizations, God is male and female equally. God is both male and female. So God, if you say the male characteristic is initiation, amongst fallen humans it's also domination. And if you say that the key female is nurture, but amongst fallen humans it's also possession. God has the equality of initiating, creating, extending, but nurturing and entering into the womb of, and giving milk and so on. So these qualities are equal in God. Bega entered into the fellowship of the ring. This protected her from abuse. It lured her into a new world of creative love. What might it mean for you to enter more fully into the fellowship of the ring? You needn't follow Tolkien's film. This is for you. This is your unique journey. What might it mean for you to enter more fully into the fellowship of the ring? The Trinity. But you're vowed to it for life. The second reflection. Oh, wait a minute. Let's get it right into our head, soul, and paper.
Ready.
So just say it one more time.
Bega entered into the fellowship of the ring, which protected her from abuse, lured her into a new world of creative love. What might it mean for you to enter more fully into the fellowship of the ring? Well, that exercise can last you for the rest of your life, but I will give you a second one. Ebba is called the mother of Northumbria. What does the mother heart of God call you to embrace?
Can you say it again, please?
Ebba is called the mother of Northumbria. What does the mother heart of God call you to embrace? And the third one, Elfrida was brought up in the Roman and Celtic traditions. If Bishop Wilfrid was the Putin of the Church, exiled because of his power politics, she sought reconciliation and a good death for him. Never give up, Churchill said. Never, ever give up. Never, ever, ever give up. That was the entire length of his speech to his old school. Gave the annual speech. Never give up. Never, ever give up. Never, ever, ever give up. Is there someone you find difficult and God is nudging you?
You mean difficult never to give up?
God is nudging you not to give up on them, to reach out to them. Any questions about the questions?
Could you repeat the third one again? Thank you.
The question at the end.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there someone you find difficult whom God is nudging you not to give up on? To either seek reconciliation or a good death or something else? Does anybody have a question?
I missed when you were saying God is both male and female, and for the male you gave initiation or domination. For female you gave nurturing, and then I missed the fourth.
Possessiveness.
Possessiveness, thank you.
That's the fallen aspect, which God isn't like.
So just repeat that question for the camera for us, really.
So the question number...
No, but the point, the point is that there's the shadow side.
In fallen humans,
Yes.
we have the God-given nature of masculinity to initiate, femininity to nurture, but also the fallen side, which with males is to dominate and with females is to possess.
Yeah.
So God has the unfallen attributes.
That's good.
Well, this is enough to keep you going for at least 5 weeks, but we have another lot
Till I return to Linda's farm.
talks tomorrow. So, and do you have any questions about where you should go to and where?
Could I ask something else about Bega? Is that okay?
About
About Bega?
yes, Bega, yes.
We, on the shores of Bassenthwaite, there's a really old chapel that's dedicated to Saint Bega. And legend has it that the bracelet is buried there, where we had our wedding.
Bassenthwaite.
there.
Oh, how interesting.
Yes,
Can
on
you?
the far shore of Bassenthwaite.
Yes.
And it's in a field, you have to walk to it.
Oh, well, if you can tell us how to get to the field, we can find it online, perhaps.
Yes, I can tell
Yes.
you.
I think we should start doing pilgrimages
St.
to them.
Bega's Church.
Yes.
Yes.
Bassenthwaite is quite near St Bees, isn't it?
It's how far?
25 miles.
20 miles. I mean, she obviously stopped. She might have stopped on her journey for weeks in one place before she
I
ended
think
up at St
local
Bees.
legend has it that she founded a small
Small monastery at
there.
Bassen.
Which is why
Fascinating.
the church,
I'm very
the
interested to hear
chapel
that.
was,
Yes.
was later built on.
Oh, I
What's
better go on
that?
holiday there.
Oh, it's lovely there.
Do you want to just finish off for the camera then? Just say thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for joining us and eavesdropping on our marvellous group from Iceland, Australia, Latford and Scotland and England and who knows where. And from Whitby, which is about to have a revival. So thank you so much for joining us and God bless you all.